Hi, Virgo. Wow. I have to be honest, this reading feels incredibly strong right from the start. The message coming through is surprisingly simple. You stopped trying to convince someone of your value. You stopped explaining. You stopped chasing answers. And somehow, that's exactly what changed everything. Okay. I feel like there is someone here who has been paying much closer attention than you realize. Not because you're doing more, not because you're reaching out, but because you're not. Your energy feels different now, calmer, stronger, more focused on yourself. And I think that's what they weren't expecting. You know, this person may have assumed you would always be there trying to hold everything together, always willing to have one more conversation, one more explanation, one more chance. But lately, something shifted, and the silence you've created around this connection seems to be speaking louder than words ever could. I'm already seeing someone looking back at the situation from a completely different perspective. Because the more you focus on your own path, the harder it becomes for them to ignore what they truly feel. I think what surprises this person the most is not what you've said recently, Virgo. It's what you've stopped saying. Because for a long time, I feel like there was an energy here where you kept trying to understand things. Maybe you tried to create clarity. Maybe you tried to give this connection room to breathe. Maybe you were the one carrying conversations that never seemed to go anywhere. But something changed. And I have to be honest, I think they felt it immediately. As I'm looking at these cards, the Hermit is sitting here so quietly, almost like a presence rather than a card. It's giving me the feeling of someone who stepped back, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started protecting their own peace. And that energy feels very much like you. You know, sometimes people expect us to react. They expect us to chase. They expect us to explain ourselves one more time. They expect us to keep the door open no matter how many times they walk through it, without truly entering. But lately, Virgo, it feels like you've become much more comfortable sitting with yourself. Much more comfortable with unanswered questions. Much more comfortable allowing people to reveal who they are without trying to manage the outcome. Wow. That's a very different version of you than the one this person remembers. And I think that's exactly why they're thinking about you so much. Because while you've been focusing on your own life, something has been happening in the background of their mind. The Four of Swords appears, and immediately I get this feeling of stillness. Not your stillness, theirs. It's almost like they're replaying conversations, replaying moments, replaying decisions. Things they dismissed before suddenly don't feel so easy to dismiss anymore. Little details about you keep resurfacing. The way you handled situations, the patience you showed, the kindness you offered. Even the things they once overlooked now seem impossible to ignore. And the strange thing is, I don't feel like anyone forced this realization. I think it happened naturally. The absence of noise created space for reflection. The absence of pressure created space for awareness. And now they're sitting with thoughts they may have spent a very long time avoiding. Because right beside that Four of Swords, I see judgment. And the energy around this card feels deeply personal. Not dramatic, not chaotic, personal. Like someone quietly looking at themselves in the mirror and asking difficult questions. Questions they can't blame on anyone else. Questions they can't run from anymore. Questions like, why did I handle things that way? Why did I keep certain feelings hidden? Why does this connection still stay with me after all this time? Why am I thinking about Virgo when I thought I had already moved on from these emotions? Okay, those questions seem to be getting louder, and the more they reflect, the more they begin to recognize that you've changed. Not in a way that feels distant, not in a way that feels cold, but in a way that feels stronger, more grounded, more secure within yourself. The Page of Swords keeps catching my attention here because it feels like curiosity, observation, awareness, somebody paying attention. Maybe more than they admit. Maybe more than they want other people to know. It's almost like they're trying to understand what happened. Trying to understand how the person they once thought they had figured out suddenly feels different. Because Virgo, your energy doesn't feel focused on proving anything anymore. It feels focused on living, growing, moving forward one step at a time. And strangely enough, that's creating a much bigger impact than any conversation ever could. I keep feeling this person looking at your silence and realizing it isn't anger, it isn't punishment, it isn't a game, it's growth. And growth has a way of making people reflect on their own choices, especially when they begin to notice how much they may have taken for granted. So, while you continue walking your own path, I don't think this person is looking at you the same way they once did. I think they're beginning to see you through a completely different lens. And for someone who once felt certain about how they viewed this connection, that realization alone is creating far more questions than answers. Because once someone starts asking those deeper questions, It's very difficult to go back to seeing life the same way. And that's exactly where this energy feels like it is. I keep looking at the Hanged Man, and I get this image of someone sitting alone with their thoughts much longer than usual, not distracted, not running, not filling every empty moment with noise, just sitting there with the things they've spent years trying not to feel. You know, for some people, silence is uncomfortable because it creates space for truth. And I think this person has entered a season where the truth keeps finding them. Little memories appear out of nowhere. Old emotions resurface when they least expect it. Certain moments suddenly look different through the lens of hindsight. Things they once justified no longer feel quite as convincing. And I have to be honest, I don't think this process has been easy. Because as the Hanged Man rests here beside death, there is a feeling that something inside them is being asked to let go. Not necessarily a person, not necessarily a relationship, a version of themselves, a way of coping, a way of avoiding, a way of protecting themselves from vulnerability. The strange thing is that they may not have realized how much of their life was being driven by old fears until recently. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of losing control, fear of being fully seen. Sometimes those fears become so familiar that people mistake them for their personality. They mistake them for wisdom, for caution, for strength. But now, something feels different, because death is sitting here quietly on the table and the energy around it doesn't feel dramatic at all. It feels honest. Like someone slowly realizing they can't carry certain emotional weights into the next chapter of their life. And maybe they've known that for a while. Maybe they've sensed it for months. Maybe they've felt this internal pressure building underneath the surface. But now it's becoming impossible to ignore. Wow. I just keep feeling this deep emotional exhaustion around them. The kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending you're okay when you're not. The kind that comes from holding together parts of your life that no longer fit. The kind that comes from constantly avoiding conversations with yourself. And Virgo, whether you intended to or not, your presence seems to have acted like a mirror, not because you demanded change, not because you pushed them. Actually, quite the opposite. The more you focused on your own healing, the more they were left alone with their own reflections. And reflections can be powerful things, especially when they reveal truths we've spent years avoiding. Temperance appears here, and everything softens for a moment. The energy slows down. The pressure eases. It's almost as if this person is beginning to understand that growth doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, one realization at a time, one difficult conversation with themselves at a time, one moment of honesty at a time. They're starting to see that healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more authentic, more aligned with who they truly are, underneath all the fear, underneath all the defenses, underneath all the expectations they've been carrying. And that brings me to strength. Okay. This card feels incredibly important because the strength I see here isn't loud. It's not forceful. It's not someone winning a battle. It's someone staying present when every instinct tells them to run. It's someone remaining open when vulnerability feels terrifying. It's someone choosing growth even when growth feels uncomfortable. And I think that's what they're learning right now. Not perfection, not certainty, just courage. The courage to sit with uncomfortable emotions. The courage to acknowledge wounds that never fully healed. The courage to admit that some of the walls they've built around themselves may no longer be serving them. There is something very human happening here, very real, very personal. And while the outside world may not fully understand what this person is going through, I feel like something profound is quietly shifting beneath the surface. Not because anyone forced it, not because anyone demanded it, but because sooner or later, every soul reaches a point where avoiding the truth becomes harder than facing it. Because once those internal shifts begin, the outside world starts looking different too. Not immediately, not all at once. But little by little, the things they once accepted without question no longer sit comfortably with them. And as I'm looking down at these cards, the Tower is standing there in a way that feels impossible to ignore. Not because something dramatic is happening overnight. It's more like a realization that keeps getting louder. A realization that certain foundations were never as stable as they appeared. You know, sometimes we spend years building our lives around assumptions. Assumptions about who we can trust. Assumptions about what success looks like. Assumptions about what we deserve. And then one day, something happens that makes us question all of it. I feel like this person is standing in that space right now. A space between what they believed and what they are beginning to see. And I have to be honest, that can be incredibly uncomfortable. Because once you start seeing the cracks, you can't pretend they aren't there anymore. The Seven of Swords catches my attention here, not in a way that feels malicious, more in a way that feels revealing, almost as if masks are slipping. People are showing their true intentions. Situations are becoming harder to romanticize. Excuses that once sounded reasonable now feel empty. And this person is beginning to recognize how much energy they've spent convincing themselves that certain things were okay when deep down they knew they weren't. Wow, that realization alone feels heavy. Because there is a difference between being deceived by someone else and deceiving yourself. And I think they're beginning to understand that some of the stories they've been telling themselves no longer fit the reality they're living. The people around them seem different now. Certain conversations feel different. Certain friendships feel different. Even familiar environments feel different. It's almost like they're walking through places they've known for years and suddenly noticing details that were always there, but somehow escaped their attention. I keep feeling this sense of awakening, not a spiritual awakening in the dramatic sense. A human awakening, the kind that happens when life quietly asks you to be honest. The kind that happens when you finally stop running from what you already know. And sitting right beside all of this is the Five of Wands. Okay, this energy feels very internal to me, because the conflict I'm seeing isn't necessarily happening around them. It's happening within them. Part of them wants to hold on to what feels familiar. Part of them knows they can't. Part of them wants to keep life exactly as it is. Part of them understands that something needs to change. And when those two versions of yourself are pulling in opposite directions, it can feel exhausting. I think that's where a lot of their energy has been going lately, trying to reconcile who they were with who they are becoming. Trying to make sense of choices that no longer align with the person they're growing into. Trying to understand why certain relationships leave them feeling drained instead of supported. Why certain environments create anxiety instead of peace. Why certain people seem to take more than they give. Because the deeper they look, the more obvious those patterns become. And that's where Queen of Swords enters this reading. The energy shifts immediately. Everything feels clearer, cleaner, more direct. I don't feel anger here, I feel clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after confusion. The kind of clarity that comes after disappointment. The kind of clarity that only arrives when someone has finally seen enough to stop making excuses. You know, I think this person is starting to understand that not everyone who stays in your life is necessarily good for you. Not everyone who agrees with you has your best interests at heart. Not everyone who asks for your time deserves your energy. Those are difficult lessons, especially for someone who spent a long time seeking validation in places that could never truly provide it. And Virgo, whether they fully realize it or not, I feel like your energy keeps showing up as a reference point during this process. Not because you're trying to teach them anything, not because you're telling them what to do, but because the way you chose peace over chaos created a contrast they can no longer ignore. The more they see what authenticity feels like, the harder it becomes to settle for anything less. And that realization seems to be changing the way they view almost everything around them. And sometimes clarity creates a feeling people never expected to experience. Loss, not because something has completely disappeared, but because they suddenly understand what was actually valuable. I keep looking at the Nine of Swords and, wow, this card feels restless. It feels like someone lying awake longer than they should. Someone replaying scenarios that cannot be changed. Someone revisiting conversations they thought they had already moved past. You know, there is a difference between missing someone's presence and realizing their absence has changed your life. And I think this person is beginning to understand that difference. Because for a long time, they may have believed there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another chance to say what needed to be said, another moment to reach out. Life has a way of making us feel like certain people will always remain where we left them. But reality doesn't work that way. People grow, people heal, people move forward. And I think what unsettles this person is the realization that you've been doing exactly that. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, the way Virgo often does. Quietly building a life that no longer revolves around waiting for someone else to decide what they want. And the more they recognize that, the heavier this energy becomes. Because Five of Cups is sitting here and it feels incredibly emotional. Not emotional in a way that seeks attention, more like private regret. The kind people carry when nobody is watching. The kind they rarely admit out loud. I keep feeling moments returning to them unexpectedly. A familiar memory while driving somewhere. A song they haven't heard in years. A place that suddenly reminds them of you. Little things. Ordinary things. The kinds of memories that become powerful because they're attached to genuine feelings. And I have to be honest. The thing they seem to miss the most isn't something grand. It isn't a dramatic gesture. It isn't some perfect moment from the past. It's how they felt around you. the comfort, the honesty, the feeling that they didn't have to perform or pretend. That energy keeps coming through very strongly, almost like they're realizing how rare that truly was. Because not every connection allows people to exhale. Not every connection creates peace. Not every connection feels safe enough for someone to be themselves. And now that distance exists, those qualities seem much easier for them to appreciate. The lovers appears here, and immediately the atmosphere changes. Everything feels softer, more vulnerable, more sincere. This card isn't arriving with urgency, it's arriving with awareness. An awareness of what the heart has been trying to say underneath all the noise. Because the truth is, feelings can be postponed. They can be ignored. They can be buried underneath responsibilities and distractions. But eventually they find their way back to the surface. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. A return, not necessarily to a person, but to an emotional truth. A truth they may have spent a very long time trying not to acknowledge. Okay, there's something deeply human about this moment. Because I don't see someone who suddenly has all the answers. I see someone realizing they don't. Someone recognizing that certainty was never the thing they were actually looking for. What they were looking for was connection, real connection. The kind that leaves a mark long after the conversation ends. And then we have Six of Cups. This card feels almost cinematic, like opening an old photo album and finding yourself smiling before you even realize it. Not because the past was perfect, but because some memories carry warmth that survives time. I keep seeing this person revisiting those moments. Not out of obsession, not out of fantasy, but because those memories remind them of who they were when they felt closest to something genuine. And the more they reflect, the more they seem to understand that what they are afraid of isn't rejection. It isn't embarrassment. It isn't uncertainty. It's the possibility that they waited too long to fully appreciate someone who brought a sense of calm into their world. That realization seems to be touching something very deep within them, something they can no longer dismiss, something they can no longer pretend doesn't matter. Because once a feeling reaches that depth, staying silent starts becoming much harder than speaking. Not immediately, not all at once. But there comes a point where reflection naturally turns into intention. And that's exactly where the energy begins to shift. I keep looking at the King of Wands and I can feel a very different version of this person emerging. Not the version that hesitated. Not the version that kept second-guessing every emotion. Not the version that waited for circumstances to magically become easier. This feels like someone slowly realizing that if something truly matters, eventually a choice has to be made. You know, there are moments in life when thinking is necessary, when stepping back is necessary, when healing is necessary. But there also comes a moment when action becomes part of the healing. And I feel like this person is standing somewhere near that realization. Because lately, their thoughts don't seem to end where they used to. They don't stop at memories anymore. They don't stop at regret. They don't stop at wondering what could have been. Their mind keeps moving toward a different question. What now? Okay, that's the questions that keeps coming through. What now? Because the more they understand themselves, the harder it becomes to ignore what their heart keeps returning to. The more they acknowledge what this connection means to them, the harder it becomes to pretend they're completely fine without addressing it. And that's where Page of Cups enters this reading. Wow. Everything softens again. The energy becomes more vulnerable, more sincere, less focused on fear, more focused on honesty. I keep feeling someone rehearsing conversations in their head, not because they know exactly what to say. Actually, I think part of the problem is that they don't. Some emotions are difficult to put into words, especially when they've been carried quietly for a long time. There is something very genuine here, almost innocent, like somebody trying to figure out how to approach a conversation that feels important. Not because they're seeking perfection, because they simply want to be understood. I have to be honest, the strongest thing I keep picking up is that they don't want to keep hiding behind distance anymore. Distance may have felt safer before. Distance may have allowed them to postpone difficult truths. Distance may have helped them avoid vulnerability. But distance is no longer providing the comfort it once did. Instead, it seems to be amplifying everything they feel. And that's where the Eight of Wands arrives. The energy starts moving, not in a reckless way, not in a dramatic way, just movement, forward movement, the kind that happens when someone finally becomes tired of standing still. I keep seeing someone reaching a point where hesitation begins losing its power. The excuses that once felt convincing don't feel as convincing anymore. The fears that once felt overwhelming don't seem as impossible as they once did, because growth has changed their perspective. The person who was afraid months ago is not exactly the same person standing here now. The person who once avoided difficult emotions has spent enough time sitting with them to understand they survived them. And that changes everything. You know, sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear. It's simply deciding that something matters more than the fear. And I think that's what this person is beginning to discover. Knight of Pentacles feels incredibly important here, because despite all of these emotions, I don't see impulsiveness. I don't see chaos. I don't see someone rushing blindly toward an outcome. I see somebody wanting to do things differently this time, wanting to show up in a way that reflects everything they've learned, wanting their actions to match their feelings, wanting consistency where there was once uncertainty, wanting sincerity where there was once confusion, and perhaps most importantly, wanting to approach this connection as the version of themselves they've been working so hard to become. Because growth changes people, not overnight, not perfectly, but enough that one day they look back at who they used to be and realize they no longer want to live from that place. I keep feeling this quiet determination around them now, a sense that something inside has finally started aligning. The heart, the mind, the lessons they've been learning. And when those pieces begin moving in the same direction, even small steps can start feeling incredibly significant. And when that alignment begins to take shape, life stops feeling like something they're merely reacting to. It starts feeling like something they're intentionally building. That's the first thing I notice as Ten of Pentacles settles onto the table. The energy here feels different from everything we've seen before. Less focused on surviving, less focused on healing old wounds, less focused on figuring out what went wrong, more focused on what could actually be created moving forward. You know, there comes a moment in every major life transition when a person realizes they can no longer build their future using the same mindset that created their past. And I think that's exactly where this person is standing, because what once felt important no longer carries the same weight. Certain fears have lost their influence. Certain distractions have lost their appeal. Certain patterns simply don't fit anymore. And what keeps emerging instead is a desire for something real, something steady, something that can withstand the passage of time. I have to be honest, this doesn't feel like someone chasing excitement. It feels like someone searching for peace. The kind of peace that cannot be purchased, cannot be forced, cannot be borrowed from other people. The kind that comes from knowing your life reflects what truly matters to you. And every time I look at your energy within this reading, Virgo, that's the quality that keeps standing out. Not perfection, not fantasy, stability, the feeling of someone who knows who they are, someone who doesn't need constant chaos to feel alive. Someone who understands that love feels different when it's built on trust instead of uncertainty. Wow, that realization seems to be changing the way they view you, because Four of Wands is creating such a warm atmosphere here. Almost like a feeling of coming home after being away for a very long time. Not necessarily a physical place, an emotional place, a place where the nervous system finally relaxes, a place where someone can stop carrying the weight of who they think they should be and simply be themselves. I keep feeling them recognize how rare that feeling actually is, because many connections create intensity. Many connections create attraction. Many connections create excitement, but very few create peace. And peace is becoming increasingly valuable to them now. The older we get, the more we begin to understand that peace is not boring. Peace is precious. And I think this person is beginning to understand that lesson on a much deeper level. King of Pentacles appears and everything feels grounded, solid, intentional. This energy isn't interested in temporary solutions. It's not interested in emotional shortcuts. It's looking toward the future, toward sustainability, toward choices that still make sense years from now. And that's a huge shift from where this story began. Because at one point, so much of their energy seemed focused on uncertainty, on fear, on hesitation. Now I'm seeing somebody who is becoming much more aware of what they actually want their life to look like. Not just emotionally, practically, daily, realistically. The people they spend time with, the environment they create, the values they live by, the relationships they invest in. Everything seems to be undergoing a quiet process of reevaluation. Okay, this feels important, because growth isn't only about what we gain. It's also about what we willingly leave behind. And I think they've reached a point where holding on to certain things simply costs too much. Too much energy, too much peace, too much authenticity, so they're learning to release what no longer belongs in the life they're trying to build. And that brings me to Ace of Pentacles. There's something beautiful about this card showing up here. Not because it promises anything, not because it guarantees a specific outcome, but because it carries the feeling of possibility. The feeling of standing at the beginning of something healthier than what existed before, something created with greater awareness, greater honesty, greater maturity. You know, when I look at this entire journey, what stands out most isn't the mistakes. It isn't the distance. It isn't the confusion. It's the growth, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, the courage to change, the decision to stop living from old fears. And perhaps that's what makes this moment feel so meaningful. Not because someone became perfect, not because every question has been answered, but because two very different paths seem to have taught lessons that could never have been learned any other way, and somewhere within all of that growth, a foundation is quietly being prepared. Not rushed, not forced, simply built one honest choice at a time. And sometimes the most meaningful changes don't happen when people are fighting to be heard. They happen when someone finally finds peace within themselves. Looking back at everything that came through today, I don't just see a story about love, I see a story about growth, about reflection, about people learning difficult lessons in their own time. And maybe that's why this energy feels so powerful. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped trying to force answers. You stopped carrying what wasn't yours to carry. You simply kept moving forward, and in doing so, you may have changed far more than you realize. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. If this reading resonated with your journey, hold on to what feels meaningful and leave the rest behind. Take care of yourself, keep choosing your peace, and I'll see you in the next reading. Bye for now.